Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 8, and this lesson we're going to be covering our ORM. And what is an ORM? Well, I'm glad you asked. An ORM, or Object Relational Mapper, takes data from a database and converts it into C# objects. Okay, notice on the left-hand side we have our database. We have our rows and columns. So the columns are first name, last name, and email address. And the rows are Tim Corey, Sue Storm, John Scott. Okay? Now we take that structure and we convert it into a structure that C# knows about. So for example, Tim Corey and the email address tim@iamtimcorey.com would go over to the right into a person model, where first name property is Tim, last name property is Corey, and the email address property is tim@iamtimcorey.com. And we create a list of those, and that would be one entry, one person model for each row in our database. So an object relational mapper is something that sits between these two entities. It takes data from one side and puts it into the other. Now, you don't have to use an object relational mapper, or ORM. It's just a convenience. There is a technology baked into C# called ADO.NET. And the purpose there is to help us get data from, let's say, a SQL Server database or other kinds, but a SQL Server database, and put it into our code. But there's steps that you then have to write on top of ADO.NET to get to the final stage where it's in models like we have to the right. Essentially, you become the ORM, or you write the code that becomes the ORM. You do it yourself. I'm not a big one for reinventing the wheel. If someone else has done it well, then I would like to just use that and move forward with writing the code that only I can write faster. Okay? So I tend to use some type of ORM. Also, ORMs have spent a lot of time on making sure their tool is as dialed in and as efficient as possible. I don't want to spend that same amount of time just on figuring out how to be as efficient as possible getting my data from one state to the other. That's why I use a tool. Now we're going to use a tool called Dapper. Now Dapper is a tool that's provided by a team from Stack Overflow. Okay, so the very, very, very large question and answer site on the web called Stack Overflow, the team behind that wrote the tool called Dapper to help with object relational mapping. Now, Dapper is what's called a micro ORM, meaning it's bare bones. It's just what you need, just enough. It just takes stuff from SQL and converts it into objects. That's pretty much all it does. And that's a good thing because there's very, very little overhead. In fact, compared to ADO.NET, Dapper is almost the same speed. What that means is it's almost as efficient as calling the bare bones minimum ADO.NET as it is to call Dapper. The difference is at the end, we don't have to do the mapping from from ADO.NET's data tables into our own objects. Dapper does that for us. Okay, so it's fast, and yet the end result is what we want. Okay, so there's a link here at the top to the GitHub page where Dapper exists. Dapper is an open source project, meaning you can go down there, create a fork, and create your own version of Dapper, or you can contribute to the existing version of Dapper if you wanted to, and you can read all the source code. Now, if you need or want more information, which you don't need for this course, but if you decide, hey, this course missed something, or I think there's more I need to know about, then there's 2 YouTube videos that will help, the Dapper intro and advanced Dapper. These are both videos I did specifically for Dapper, and they're pretty comprehensive in what they cover. Again, you don't need those for this course because I will teach you everything you need to know to get through this course. And this course is going to cover about 95% of the scenarios that you would have in the real world. It's just that when you run into those other 5%, that's where these more in-depth videos will probably help you. Okay? So we're going to use a tool called Dapper because it is very, very, very efficient and it is easy to use. I want my customers to receive the efficiency. I can do the same things in Entity Framework and be efficient with Entity Framework, but it takes a lot more work and a lot more knowledge than people realize. Okay? Part of the problem is the Entity Framework is very easy to create a database connection. It's harder to do so efficiently. Okay? There are ways to make Entity Framework very, very efficient, especially Entity Framework Core, which is what we'll cover in this course. But it's also very easy to make a mistake. Okay? So for example, if you do in a where clause, if you put a bit of code that evaluates the values to see if it should come back or not, that seems obvious because it's just more C# code. But what you don't necessarily realize, now it's going to warn you now that Entity Framework Core 3.0 came out, I think it's 3.0, that fixes this. It's going to put a warning there finally, because what happens is, because you put something in the where clause that's C# code, it's going to have to pull back every single row from the database. That's not a problem in development, where development you're doing 100, 200 rows of data. In production, that can be a massive issue. If you're pulling back 1 million records in order to find 5, that's an issue. Okay? And until now, Entity Framework wouldn't even tell you. And that's why I say it's very easy every situation will require adaptation and adjustment. Okay? That's just how it works, because life is not clean and pretty and neat. Sometimes you have ugly, messy situations. Most of the time. In the real world, it's ugly and messy. And so making the right choice there depends on a lot of different factors, one of which is your team. If you're working with people who are really good at Entity Framework and are really not good with SQL, you may find that Entity Framework is the right choice for you. If you have a team that's really great at SQL, probably Dapper is a better choice for you. Okay? If you don't know, default with Dapper, but figure out if that's the best choice by saying, is there any reason to go anywhere else? Okay? So make those choices and adjustments for every situation. Don't just blindly follow one guidance for everything. Okay? Now, today's homework, those 2 YouTube channel links I gave you, bookmark those. Because if you start using Dapper as your default, you're probably going to need those videos sometime in the future. You don't have to watch them now. It's not really, you want to focus on learning in this path first. But later, when you start using Dapper with what I put in quotes, real code, and by real code I mean code that you're going to use in production somewhere, you're probably going to come across a scenario or two where we haven't covered it in this course. Okay? And in that case, there'll probably be coverage of it in one of those 2 videos. All right? So bookmark those 2 YouTube videos for later, and then once you're done with that, come on back for the next lesson.